Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome everyone to the deep dive. Our goal here is always to give you that shortcut to really getting informed. We try to slice through these complex topics, pull out those key insights for you. So today we're really plunging into, well, a pretty fundamental question. How do living things interact with each other and, with their environment? And our source material for this is Chapter 31 of Raven Biology of Plants, the 8th edition. It's all about the dynamics of communities and ecosystems. Our mission really is to make this stuff, ecology, which can seem pretty complex, not just clear, but, well, engaging. Think of it like your fast pass to understanding what's essential in this chapter. You're going to get a handle on that whole web of life, how energy flows, why plants are basically fighting for sunlight, how whole landscapes change over time. Just picture yourself standing at a forest, maybe looking into a pond. It's not static, right? It's this dynamic system, always changing, always interacting. And we're going to reveal those unseen forces.
And that concept of a system, that's really central here. Ecology isn't just, looking at single organisms in isolation. It's specifically the study of ecosystems. And that means thinking about interacting parts. All the living things, plants, animals, microbes, and their non-living surroundings like water, air, rocks, minerals. What's fascinating here is, well, the whole system has what we call emergent properties.
Emergent properties. That sounds interesting. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Right. So think about it like this. You have individual musicians, right? They're skilled. But the symphony, the music they create together, that's something new, something more than just the individual parts. That's an emergent property. An ecosystem works like that too. It's much more than just adding up the species list. You get these unique qualities, these processes that only happen at these higher levels of organization. You start with individuals, they form populations, populations make up communities, and all of that interacting with the physical environment. That's your ecosystem.
Okay, that makes sense. So here's where it gets really interesting for me. The energy. What's actually powering this whole system?
Energy. It's the constant engine, you could say, the fundamental driver. Every living thing needs a continuous supply of usable energy. And it's a one-way flow. Energy gets captured, it's processed, used, and then eventually it dissipates. It becomes unusable heat. That's the second law of thermodynamics in action. It never cycles back like materials do.
So where does this energy journey begin? Who kicks it off?
It starts with the autotrophs. The self-feeders. Now, there are some microbes, chemosynthesizers, that get energy from inorganic molecules, like down in deep ocean vents. But they're a smaller piece of the puzzle overall. The vast majority are the photosynthesizers. These are the green plants, phytoplankton. They're converting solar energy into organic stuff. They are the primary producers. And you have heterotrophs, the other feeders. These are all the organisms that get energy by consuming other organisms, living or dead. And some organisms, like the Indian paintbrush mentioned in the chapter, actually do both. They photosynthesize and they parasitize other plants.
Right, so that brings us to how this energy actually moves through the system. We talk about food chains, but what's the more scientific term ecologists use?
Ecologists talk about trophic levels. Think of it like steps in the energy flow. The first trophic level, that's your primary producers, those autotrophs, trees, algae, cyanobacteria. Then the second trophic level is the primary consumers. These are the herbivores, like a caterpillar munching on a leaf. They eat the producers. Then comes the third trophic level, the secondary consumers. Carnivores, like maybe a warbler that eats that caterpillar. And you can go higher. Tertiary consumers, like a kestrel eating the warbler, making up the fourth trophic level, and so on, maybe top carnivores.
Yeah.
But what's really powerful here is the insight that ecosystems rarely have more than, say, 4 to 6 trophic levels.
Huh. Why is there such a strict limit? 4 to 6 doesn't seem like that many steps.
Yeah, it comes down to physics, really. Thermodynamics. First off, less than 1% of the solar energy hitting plants actually gets incorporated into their biomass. It's surprisingly inefficient. And then, even more critically, when something eats something else, only about 1/10, just 10% of the energy from one trophic level actually gets assimilated, built into the biomass of the next level. So the energy drops off incredibly fast at each step. There's just not much left after a few links in the chain. And this basic principle, it explains a lot. Like why the biggest land animals ever, think Argentinosaurus, were herbivores.
Ah, because their food source, plants, was just so abundant at that first trophic level.
Exactly. There was enough energy available right there at the base.
That also helps make sense of that world is green idea, right? Why aren't all the plants just instantly eaten if they're the base?
Precisely. It's not just about energy availability. Herbivore numbers are often limited by their own predators and parasites. Plus, plants themselves have evolved all sorts of defenses, thorns, tough leaves, chemicals to avoid being eaten. Now think about all the stuff that doesn't get eaten immediately or just dies naturally. What happens to all that dead organic matter? This is where the decomposers or detritivores come in. They are, you could say, the unsung heroes of the ecosystem. We're talking fungi, bacteria, earthworms, even things like burying beetles. They feed on all that dead organic stuff.
And their role is absolutely critical, isn't it? It's not just cleanup.
Oh, absolutely vital. Without decomposers, the whole biosphere would literally be buried in dead leaves, logs, bodies, and more importantly, all the essential nutrients locked up in that dead material wouldn't get recycled back into the system for plants to use again. They're absolutely essential for releasing those nutrients and building healthy soils. And this whole energy transfer efficiency thing, it has really profound implications for humans, too. Think about that Lake Cayuga example in the text. 1,000 kilocalories of light energy captured by algae might only translate to about 6 kilocalories if a human eats smelt that ate the algae eaters.
Wow, that's a tiny fraction.
It is. So eating lower on the food chain, eating plants directly instead of eating animals that ate plants, is just vastly more energy efficient. It's a key reason why vegetarian diets can support much larger human populations, especially in densely settled parts of the world.
And ecologists use these visual models, these pyramids, to show these dynamics, right?
Yes, exactly. They're helpful ways to visualize structure. The pyramid of energy is the most fundamental. It always has a broad base, the producers, and narrows sharply as you go up each trophic level. It perfectly shows that energy dissipation we talked about. Then there's the pyramid of biomass, which is the total weight of living organisms at each level. Usually it looks like the energy pyramid, more plant mass than herbivore mass, and so on. But there's a fascinating exception, sometimes seen in aquatic systems. You can get an inverted biomass pyramid.
Inverted, how does that work?
Well, you might have phytoplankton, tiny algae, that reproduce incredibly quickly. So at any single moment, their total biomass might be less than the zooplankton that are constantly grazing on them. But because they reproduce so fast, they can still support that larger biomass of zooplankton over time.
Okay, that's neat. And the last one.
The pyramid of numbers. This one just counts the number of individual organisms at each level. Its shape can vary a lot. Think about it. One single large tree can support maybe thousands of insects feeding on it. So the base might be narrow, and the next level much wider. Now, thinking about decomposition again, the rate at which it happens is really important, and it links, maybe surprisingly, to our global energy situation. Decomposition is fast, where it's warm, moist, and there's plenty of oxygen, like a tropical rainforest. But where it's very dry or waterlogged and oxygen poor, like in bogs or wetlands, decomposition slows way down. And when that happens, organic matter piles up. Over geological time, huge accumulations of this partially decomposed organic matter buried under heat and pressure got transformed into coal, oil, and natural gas. Our fossil fuels, they're essentially ancient, stored solar energy captured by photosynthesis millions of years ago.
Oh, so we're literally running our cars on sunshine from the Carboniferous period.
In a very real sense, yes. And the critical insight here, the wake-up call perhaps, is the rate at which we're using them. The text estimates that annual coal consumption is something like 60,000 times greater than the rate at which coal formed historically.
60,000 times. That's staggering.
It is, and it really underscores why we urgently need sustainable energy sources. Biofuels are part of that discussion, things like hybrid poplars, switchgrass, algae, but there are real ecological questions about land use, energy input, and their overall impact. It's not a simple solution. And hanging over all of this, of course, is global climate change. Human activities are pushing changes faster than most natural cycles we've seen in the past. There's a strong consensus highlighted in the chapter about the need to cut fossil fuel use, particularly in affluent countries, and really explore all the renewable options we have.
Okay, so we've talked about energy flowing in these sort of linear chains or levels, but reality is messier, right? That brings us to food webs.
Exactly. Food chains are a simplification. A food web tries to show all the feeding connections among the different species or groups within an ecosystem. They get incredibly complex very quickly. Even a small pond's food web would have hundreds, maybe thousands of links if you drew them all, so diagrams are always simplified. And you see complications everywhere. Lots of animals are omnivores, like us humans, feeding at multiple trophic levels. Or think about fish. Many start small, eating plankton, then eat insects, then smaller fish as they grow. Their trophic level changes throughout their life. And we also need to account for parasites, Organisms that live on or in a host, feeding on it, but usually not killing it outright. Think viruses, bacteria, fungi, roundworms. They're always one trophic level above their host.
Okay, and there's another related group mentioned, parasitoids. How are they different?
Yes. Parasitoids are mostly insects, like certain wasps and flies. They lay their eggs inside another host insect, like a caterpillar. Their larvae then develop inside the host, eating it from the inside out, and this inevitably kills the host when the adult parasitoid emerges. It's pretty gruesome, but ecologically important. Now, looking at the whole food web, there's a key hypothesis. The more diverse the web, the more different pathways energy can take, the more stable and resilient the ecosystem might be.
Resilience meaning it can bounce back better after a disturbance.
Exactly. If one food source disappears, predators might have alternatives, helping the system recover.
Okay, so energy flows through, gets dissipated. But what about the actual materials? The atoms, the elements, are they lost too?
No, and that's an absolutely crucial difference. Unlike energy, materials, the actual atoms like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, they get recycled within ecosystems. Think about it. Every nitrogen atom in your body right now has probably been part of countless other organisms before you. Plants, animals, microbes, cycled over and over. Now, these cycles look different for different elements. Water, carbon, nitrogen, they have global cycles, often involving a gaseous phase in the atmosphere. Others, like phosphorus, calcium, iron, tend to have more local cycles, moving mainly through soil and water in solution or as particles. And elements exist in different compartments in the environment. Some might be locked away in deep rocks for thousands of years, basically unavailable. Others are in the soil solution as available nutrients, ready for plants to take up immediately.
And presumably, some of these recycled nutrients are more likely to be in short supply to limit plant growth than others.
Definitely. Certain nutrients are often limiting factors. Water, of course, is fundamental. Lack of water limits productivity in huge parts of the world, like the Atacama Desert example. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere can actually be below the optimum for photosynthesis sometimes, though human activity is rapidly increasing that concentration, leading to global warming concerns. And nitrogen. Nitrogen is essential for proteins, DNA, everything, but it's often deficient in soils in a form plants can use. Nature's primary solution for this is nitrogen fixation. Specialized bacteria, some living freely, others in partnerships with plants like legumes and their root nodules, can convert atmospheric nitrogen gas into usable ammonia.
And humans have figured out how to do that too, right? Industrially.
Yes, the Haber-Bosch process for making synthetic nitrate fertilizers was a massive technological leap. It hugely increased food production. But the powerful insight here is how this human intervention has drastically altered the global nitrogen cycle. All that extra nitrogen washes off fields, causing major environmental problems like the hypoxic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow. There was a really famous study mentioned that looked at these nutrient cycles on a whole ecosystem scale, right? The Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest Study.
Yes, a classic. Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire is really a landmark in ecosystem science. What they did was ingenious. They used small forested valleys, watersheds, where they could measure precisely what was coming in, rain, snow, even dust, and what was going out in the single stream draining the valley. They built weirs, like little dams with V-notches, to measure the water flow and its chemical content accurately. And in the undisturbed mature forest watersheds, they found something remarkable.
What was that?
They found that these ecosystems are incredibly good at holding on to their mineral nutrients. They're very tight. For example, they measured only about a 0.3% annual loss of calcium, and nitrogen was actually accumulating in the system, more coming in than leaving.
But then they did a pretty drastic experiment, didn't they?
They did. In one watershed, they cut down all the trees and shrubs. They didn't remove the logs, but they used herbicides to prevent anything from regrowing for a few years. The results were immediate and, frankly, stunning. Stream runoff increased dramatically, about 4 times higher because the trees weren't there to intercept rain and transpire water. But the really big shock was the nutrient loss. It went through the roof. Calcium and potassium losses were about 20 times higher than in the undisturbed forest.
20 times. Why such a huge difference?
Well, think about it. The decomposers in the soil, the microbes, they kept doing their job, breaking down dead organic matter and releasing mineral nutrients like nitrate. But with no living plants there to quickly absorb those soluble ions, they just washed out of the soil with the increased water flow and into the stream. Nitrate concentrations in the stream water shot up so high they actually exceeded the safe levels for drinking water, and it caused an algal bloom downstream.
So what's the big takeaway from Hubbard Brook then?
The undeniable conclusion was how Absolutely vital. The living biological community, especially the plants, is for maintaining soil fertility and preventing nutrient loss. They aren't just passive bystanders, they actively regulate the system, holding on to these precious elements against the physical forces like water flow that would otherwise leach them away.
Okay, so we've covered energy flow, nutrient cycling. But ecology is also fundamentally about how organisms interact directly, right? That old saying, everything is connected. What are the main types of interactions?
Right. Beyond just eating or being eaten, there are these intimate connections. The chapter groups them into three main categories: competition, mutualism, and predation, which includes herbivory and parasitism. Let's start with competition. This happens whenever two or more organisms require the same resource, like light, water, nutrients, space, and that resource is in limited supply. It's a really fundamental driving force in evolution and natural selection. You can prove it experimentally, remove competitors, and the remaining organisms often do better. Now, plants compete intensely. For light, especially where water and nutrients are plentiful, growing taller is often the winning strategy. Trees are kind of the ultimate winners in the evolutionary race for light, investing heavily in woody stems to get above everyone else.
But not all plants are trees. There must be other strategies.
Absolutely. You have shade-tolerant plants that thrive in the dim understory. Or think of spring wildflowers, the ephemerals that pop up, flower, and set seed early in spring before the trees fully leaf out and block the sun. In dry areas like deserts, the main battle is often underground competition for water. This leads to plants being spaced very far apart. Although, interestingly, you can also see a nurse effect where larger, established shrubs might actually protect young seedlings of other species, like cacti, from the harsh sun and heat, creating little islands of life.
This constant struggle sounds like it could lead to winners and losers, which brings up the principle of competitive exclusion. Does that mean that eventually only one species can survive in a given spot if they need the same things?
That's what the principle predicts, yes. Two species with very similar needs competing for the same limited resources can't coexist indefinitely in the same stable habitat. Eventually, one will edge the other out. The book gives that classic example with two species of duckweed, lemna. One species, Elgiba, wasn't necessarily the fastest grower on its own, but in mixed culture, it won because it had these little air sacs that made it float higher, shading out the other species, L. polyrhiza. A really subtle adaptation made all the difference in competition. But this leads to a really important question, doesn't it? If competitive exclusion is so powerful, why do we see so many different species living together?
Exactly. That's the puzzle. You walk into a temperate forest, there might be 10, 20 tree species. Tropical forest, hundreds. How can they all coexist if this principle holds?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is complex, involving several factors. First, specialization is key. The environment isn't uniform, it's patchy. What makes a species a good competitor in one microsite, maybe a wetter spot or a sunnier patch, might make it a poor competitor elsewhere. Different species dominate in different parts of the mosaic. A sugar maple won't thrive in a desert, obviously. Then there are other ways coexistence happens. Sometimes you have balancing specializations, like the Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir in the Rockies example. Fir seedlings do better in shade, spruce does better in sunnier, drier spots created by disturbances. Neither can completely take over because conditions vary.
So disturbances prevent a total takeover.
Often, yes. Another factor is that competitive exclusion can be incredibly slow. If two species are really well adapted and only slightly different in their needs, it might take thousands of years for one to actually exclude the other. And don't forget herbivory. Grazing animals can sometimes keep the most competitive plant species in check, preventing them from dominating and thus allowing less competitive species to hang on. Think rabbits in English grasslands or stressful conditions on prairies limiting aggressive grasses. It's even possible that evolutionary processes just generate new species faster than competition can weed them out in some cases. And sometimes competition takes a more chemical form. That's allelopathy.
Chemical warfare between plants.
Essentially, yes. One organism produces chemicals that inhibit the growth or survival of another, like the penicillium mold producing penicillin to fight bacteria, or sorghum plants releasing chemicals that suppress weeds. The creosote bush is a great plant example. Its roots release compounds that inhibit the growth of competing burrowweed and even other creosote seedlings, effectively carving out its own space.
Okay, so lots of competition. But you mentioned cooperation too.
Right, that brings us to mutualism. This is a type of symbiosis, which just means living together, but specifically mutualism is where both species benefit from the interaction. It's a win-win. Mycorrhizas are a classic, incredibly widespread example. These are fungi living in close association with plant roots. We talked about them back in chapter 14. The fungus gets sugars from the plant. In return, the plant gets a huge boost in absorbing water and mineral nutrients because the fungal threads, hyphae, are much better at exploring the soil and extracting resources than plant roots alone. It's a vital partnership for most plants.
And the book had that really striking example with ants and acacia trees.
Ah, yes, the acacia trees and pseudomyrmex ants in the tropics, a fantastic example of coevolution. The acacia tree provides specialized structures just for the ants, enlarged thorns that serve as nests, nectaries on the leaves that provide sugar, and even special protein and oil-rich structures called belchin bodies for food.
So the tree is basically feeding and housing the ants. What do the ants do in return?
They are fierce protectors. Daniel Jansen did famous experiments showing this. The ants constantly patrol the plant. They attack and sting any herbivores, insects, or even mammals that try to eat the acacia. They'll even chew away and girdle vines or branches from other plants that try to grow onto the acacia, preventing shading. Jansen showed if you experimentally remove the ants, the acacia trees grow much slower, suffer heavy herbivore damage, and often get overgrown and die. The ants, in turn, are completely dependent on the acacia for survival. It's an obligate mutualism.
Wow. Okay, so we have competition, we have mutualism, then there are the interactions where one benefits and the other is harmed.
Right.
Plant herbivore and plant pathogen interactions. That sounds like that arms race idea again.
It absolutely is a constant co-evolutionary struggle. Plants evolve defenses, physical ones like spines or tough leaves, and chemical ones. These defensive chemicals are often called secondary metabolites. They're not involved in basic metabolism like photosynthesis, but serve other roles, often defense. Tannins are a good example. They're phenolic compounds that taste bad and make plant tissues indigestible. When oak trees get attacked by gypsy moths, the new leaves they produce often have higher tannin levels, making them worse food for the larvae. Or snowshoe hares browsing on birch trees can trigger the tree to produce new shoots rich in distasteful resins.
And sometimes the herbivores find ways around these defenses, or even use them.
Exactly. Some insects have evolved ways to detoxify or tolerate these chemicals, and some, like the famous monarch butterfly, actually sequester the poisons, cardiac glycosides, from the milkweed plants they eat. The poisons don't harm the caterpillar, but they make the adult butterfly toxic and distasteful to predators like birds. The plant's weapon becomes the insect's shield. It's fascinatingly complex.
And humans have tried to use these herbivore interactions to our advantage, right? In biological control.
Yes, sometimes with great success, sometimes with problems. The goal is to use a specific herbivore, usually from the invasive plant's native range, to control its population where it has become a pest. The classic textbook example is the prickly pear cactus in Australia. It was introduced and spread uncontrollably over vast areas. Then scientists introduced the Cactoblastis cactus moth from South America. Its larvae burrows into and feed on the cactus pads, and they were incredibly effective, drastically reducing the cactus populations.
So it worked perfectly.
In that case, largely yes. Another example mentioned is using European beetles to control invasive purple loosestrife in North America. But there's a huge caveat. You have to be extremely careful that the introduced control agent is highly specific to the target pest plant, because if it starts attacking native plants, you've just created a new problem. The same cactus moth, Cactoblastis, later spread from introductions in the Caribbean to Florida and is now moving west, threatening native prickly pear species in the U.S. and Mexico. It highlights the potential dangers. Careful, rigorous testing is absolutely essential.
Okay, stepping back a bit, what's become really clear is that these living systems, these communities and ecosystems, they are constantly dynamic. Change seems to be the only constant.
That's a fundamental truth. Change is inherent. Ecosystems require energy flow, environments shift, organisms interact. Stasis isn't really the natural state.
Yeah, I mean, even keeping your lawn looking the same requires constant mowing, watering, weeding, constant intervention to prevent change.
Exactly. And ecologists have thought about this change in different ways over time. There were older ideas, maybe more extreme views. One was a highly cooperative model, almost like species working together towards some stable ideal climax community, F.E. Clements' idea, or even shades of the Gaia hypothesis. The opposite extreme was pure nature red and tooth and claw, constant struggle, competition, predation with no real stability. The modern view, and what the chapter emphasizes, is more of a middle ground. Ecosystems clearly show both cooperation, like mutualisms, and competition. They exhibit patterns of change and recovery.
And that predictable pattern of change is called succession.
Yes. Succession is the somewhat predictable process of change in the species composition and structure of a community over time, especially following a disturbance or as a new habitat becomes available. We often talk about secondary succession. This is what happens on land that previously supported life but was disturbed, like an abandoned farm field reverting to forest. You typically see a sequence. First, weedy annual plants, then perennial grasses and herbs, then shrubs, then fast-growing pioneer trees like pines or aspens, and eventually longer-lived, more shade-tolerant trees like oaks or maples might dominate, depending on the region. Clement's idea of a single, stable climax community as the inevitable endpoint for any given region has been seen as a bit too rigid. Real ecosystems often have recurring disturbances like floods on a floodplain that prevent that final state from ever being reached or maintained permanently. So modern ecology talks more about concepts like resilience, the ability of a system to bounce back after disturbance, instability, or resistance to change, and acknowledges that sometimes, if a disturbance is profound enough, the system might shift to a completely different state, maybe almost irreversibly.
Okay, so that's secondary succession, starting with soil. What about starting from scratch? Primary succession.
Right. Primary succession is colonization and change happening in environments that are essentially barren, lacking soil, where life has to build the substrate itself. Think about a landscape after a glacier retreats, leaving bare rock or gravel, or a new volcanic island. A classic example is a lake gradually filling in with sediment and organic debris over centuries or millennia. It becomes a marsh, then maybe a wet meadow, and eventually perhaps a forest. The habitat itself is changing. Or picture lichens and mosses colonizing a bare rock face. They slowly break down the rock chemically and physically, trap dust and debris, and eventually, over very long timescales, help create the first beginnings of soil, paving the way for other plants.
There are some dramatic examples of this after big events, too, right?
Oh yes. The Krakatoa eruption in 1883 completely sterilized the island with volcanic ash, but life recolonized remarkably quickly. Wind and sea brought spores and seeds. Birds arrived, bringing more seeds. Cyanobacteria and ferns were early pioneers, followed eventually by a diverse tropical forest. More recently, the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. The lateral blast and ashfall devastated huge areas. But recovery began surprisingly fast in some places, partly from organisms that survived underground, like burrowing mammals and plants with underground roots or rhizomes. Wind-dispersed seeds arrived, and crucially, pioneer species like lupines played a key role. Lupines can fix nitrogen, adding this vital nutrient to the sterile volcanic ash, which helped other plants get established.
So even when an ecosystem seems to have recovered, like a mature forest, change is still happening, just maybe on a smaller scale.
Absolutely. Change continues, often through what ecologists call gaps. These are small to medium-sized disturbances that open up the forest canopy, most commonly when a large tree falls due to wind, disease, or old age. This creates a patch of highlight on the forest floor. The chapter mentions turnover times, how long it takes, on average, for any given spot in the forest to experience a gap, maybe 60 to 250 years in tropical forests, perhaps around 100 years in temperate ones.
And how do these gaps get filled?
Several ways. There might already be suppressed young trees or seedlings waiting in the understory, the seedling bank, ready to shoot up when the light hits. Or seeds that have been dormant in the soil, the seed bank, might germinate. Or new seeds might arrive via wind or animals. Different species are good at exploiting gaps in different ways.
And besides falling trees, fire is another huge agent of disturbance and change, right? Both natural and human cost.
A very significant one, yes. Especially in certain types of ecosystems. Humans have used fire to manage landscapes for millennia. The example of sugar pine forests in the Sierra Nevada is really instructive. Historically, frequent, low-intensity ground fires were common. They burned through the undergrowth, killed some smaller trees, but generally didn't kill the large fire-resistant sugar pines and ponderosa pines. This maintained open, park-like forests.
But then fire suppression became the policy for a long time.
Exactly. For much of the 20th century, the goal was to put out all fires. This allowed shade-tolerant species like firs and cedars to grow densely in the understory, creating a fuel ladder. So now, when fires do start, they can easily climb up into the crowns of the large trees, leading to incredibly destructive high-intensity crown fires that kill everything and are much harder to control. It's a huge problem across the western U.S. now.
But then there are plants that actually need fire.
Yes, like the Takata cypress. It has serotinous cones, meaning they only open and release their seeds after being exposed to the heat of a fire. So it depends on fire for reproduction, but it's also very sensitive to heat itself and takes many years to mature and produce seeds. So if fires become too frequent, like near the US-Mexico border due to human ignitions, they can wipe out populations before the plants have had a chance to set seed for the next generation.
And climate change is factoring into this too, like the pinyon juniper dieback.
Yes, severe droughts, often linked to climate change, combined with insect outbreaks, have caused massive die-offs of pinyon pines and junipers in the Southwest. It raises serious questions about whether these woodlands will recover to their previous state, or if the climate is shifting towards favoring different vegetation types, like grasslands or shrublands.
So the big insight here seems to be that humans can mess things up by having too much fire or too little fire, depending on the ecosystem. Finding the right balance, the right fire frequency, is really tricky.
It is. Adjusting fire regimes is a critical management challenge, and it's often as much a social and political issue as it is ecological. And all this leads naturally to the field of restoration ecology.
Trying to fix the damage,
Yeah.
basically.
In essence, yes. It's the science and practice of assisting the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And it's incredibly important because healthy, natural ecosystems provide all sorts of essential ecological services: clean air, clean water, pollination, climate regulation, often much more effectively and sustainably than any engineered solution we could devise. We need to be humble about our ability to manage the entire global ecosystem. The University of Wisconsin Arboretum in Madison is mentioned as a pioneering example. Starting way back in the 1930s, they began restoring prairies, forests, and wetlands on damaged agricultural land. They learned a tremendous amount about how these ecosystems function, including the critical role of fire in maintaining healthy prairie ecosystems, through the very process of trying to put them back together. Restoration efforts are happening elsewhere too, like in those ponderosa pine forests out west, trying to thin out the dense understory and reintroduce controlled, low-intensity fires to reduce the risk of catastrophic crown fires.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, from energy flow to succession and fire. Wrapping this up, what does this all mean? For us, for you, the listener, trying to understand our planet. The chapter highlights 4 key principles, right?
Yes, 4 really crucial takeaways from ecology for how we think about and manage our world.
Okay, the first one is dynamism. Things are always changing, there's no perfect balance, no fixed equilibrium, and importantly, not all change is necessarily good or predictable.
Second, diversity and complexity. The deeper we look, the more intricate life turns out to be. We honestly don't fully understand why there's so much diversity. But as the great conservationist Aldo Leopold said, to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. We should be careful about losing pieces we don't understand.
Third, connectedness. Everything really is linked. Energy flows, material cycles, species interact in countless ways. Competition, mutualism, predation, decomposition. You can't really isolate one part without affecting others.
And finally, perhaps most importantly, partial knowledge. Our understanding of these incredibly complex systems is always incomplete, always evolving. We have to keep learning, keep observing, keep testing our ideas directly against nature itself. Humility is key.
So bringing it all together, this deep dive into just one chapter of plant ecology really shows us how incredible ecosystems are.
They truly are. These self-sustaining systems, processing energy, cycling materials, constantly shaped by this amazing array of interactions, competition, cooperation, disturbance, recovery.
Understanding these dynamics, even at this level, it feels essential.
It really is. It's critical not just for appreciating the wonder of the natural world, but also for facing the huge challenges of our own impact on the global ecosystem we all depend on.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dynamics of communities and ecosystems. We really hope this gives you a solid handle on these core ecological ideas, and we hope you'll keep exploring the amazing world of plants. From all of us here at The Deep Dive, thanks for learning with us.